A battalion of American soldiers moves inland from the invasion beaches, advancing toward German positions dug into the hills above the Seal River. Their uniforms are identical to any other unit in the U.S. Fifth Army. Their faces are not. These are the men of the 100th Infantry Battalion, American-born sons of Japanese immigrants, drawn largely from the territory of Hawaii. Barely 2 years earlier, the United States government had classified people who looked like them as potential enemies of the state. Now they were the first Japanese-American combat unit sent to fight in the European theater of World War II. Problem they carried onto that battlefield was not tactical, it was political and it was personal. More than 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of them United States citizens, had been forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and confined in incarceration camps under Executive Order 9066, signed in February 1942. Their loyalty had been publicly questioned by the same government that now asked some of their sons to fight and die for it. This is the history of how that contradiction was resolved on the battlefields of Italy, through Salerno, the Volturno River, Monte Cassino, Anzio, and the drive to Rome, culminating in a combat record that would make the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, by size and length of service, the most decorated unit in the history of the United States Army. To understand why this unit existed at all, it is necessary to understand the crisis in American policy that followed the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In the weeks after the attack, fear and suspicion toward Japanese Americans spread rapidly, particularly on the West Coast. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to designate exclusion zones. Under this authority, more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of them native-born United States citizens, were removed from their homes and sent to remote incarceration camps in the interior of the country. The military's initial response to Japanese American men of draft age was equally severe. Their draft status was reclassified to 4C, enemy alien, making them ineligible for service regardless of citizenship. In Hawaii, where Japanese Americans made up roughly a third of the territorial population, young men who had been serving in the Hawaii Territorial Guard and the University of Hawaii's Reserve Officers Training Corps were abruptly dismissed from duty in January 1942, without formal explanation. Some of those dismissed cadets organized themselves into a labor unit called the Varsity Victory Volunteers, performing construction and support work for the military in Hawaii, a project intended in part to demonstrate loyalty and press for the restoration of the right to serve in combat. That pressure, combined with military manpower needs and lobbying from officials who had observed the reliability of Japanese American National Guard units already in federal service, produced a shift in policy. On January 28, 1943, the War Department announced it would form an all-Nisei combat team and reopen selective service to Japanese American volunteers. Roosevelt endorsed the decision publicly, declaring that Americanism is not and never was a matter of race or ancestry. The unit that would emerge from this policy reversal, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, was formally activated February 1, 1943. Existing solutions to the loyalty question, as the government defined it, had already failed. Mass incarceration had not proven disloyalty. It had manufactured resentment while doing nothing to answer the underlying question military planners actually needed answered: whether Japanese American soldiers could be trusted in combat. Bureaucratic loyalty questionnaires administered in the camps produced confusion, and in some cases, principled refusal from internees resisting the injustice of being asked to swear loyalty while their families remained in barbed wire enclosures. The only test that would ultimately settle the matter was combat itself. Before the 442nd existed, a smaller unit had already been fighting in North Africa and Italy, the 100th Infantry Battalion. The 100th was built from Nisei soldiers of the Hawaii National Guard, men who had been serving before Pearl Harbor and were not swept up by the West Coast exclusion orders. Rather than disband them, the Army organized them into a segregated unit, initially designated the Hawaiian Provisional Infantry Battalion, and shipped them to the mainland for training at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and later Camp Shelby, Mississippi. They deployed to North Africa in 1943 and then to the Italian mainland, landing at Salerno on September 22, 1943, as part of the 34th Infantry Division's 133rd Infantry Regiment under General Mark W. Clark's Fifth Army. More than 12,000 Nisei volunteers answered the War Department's 1943 call to form the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. From that pool, roughly 2,686 volunteers came from Hawaii, and about 1,500 came directly out of the mainland incarceration camps, men who volunteered for the Army while their own families remained behind fences. They trained together for a year at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, before shipping out to Italy, arriving May 1, 1944. Command of these units rested with white officers, standard practice for segregated units in the Army at the time. Colonel Charles W. Pence commanded the 442nd through its early Italian campaign. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil R. Miller, born in San Germán, Puerto Rico, later took command and led the regiment through its most costly engagement in the Vosges Mountains of France. Overall Allied ground operations in Italy were directed by Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark, commanding the U.S. Fifth Army. Individual soldiers within the ranks would go on to national prominence. Daniel Inao, a platoon sergeant who later lost his right arm in combat in Italy, became a United States Senator from Hawaii. Young Ok Kim, a Korean-American officer serving with the 100th Battalion, itself a notable exception to the unit's near-total Japanese-American composition, became one of its most decorated and effective combat leaders. Before the 100th and 442nd proved themselves in Italy, official skepticism about Japanese-American loyalty had already produced one failed policy after another. Blanket incarceration itself was the first failure, a policy justified on military necessity grounds that produced no verified sabotage or espionage cases among Japanese Americans, either before or after its implementation, while consuming enormous administrative and logistical resources better spent on the actual war effort. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and Naval Intelligence had already conducted pre-war assessments of the Japanese American community in Hawaii and found no evidence to justify mass removal there. One reason Hawaii's much larger Japanese American population was never subjected to mass incarceration the way West Coast communities were. The loyalty questionnaire distributed in the camps in early 1943, intended to sort loyal from disloyal internees and identify potential recruits, was widely regarded as poorly designed. Its wording, particularly two questions asking whether respondents would serve in combat duty and whether they would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States while renouncing any allegiance to the Japanese emperor, created confusion and, for some incarcerated citizens, an impossible position. Renouncing an allegiance they had never held implied they had held it in the first place. The process produced a small but significant group of resistors and a great deal of internal community conflict, none of which advanced the military's actual goal of identifying willing and capable soldiers. On the battlefield itself, conventional infantry tactics against fortified German positions in the Italian mountains had already proven costly and slow for other Allied units through late 1943, and into the Monte Cassino battles of early 1944, where repeated frontal assaults against German defenses anchored on Monte Cassino's Abbey Heights, part of the Gustav Line, produced heavy Allied casualties for limited gains between January and May 1944. The breakthrough here was not a single invention, but a demonstrated combat record that reversed years of official doubt, achieved through specific, documented actions in the field. At Salerno and along the Volturno River in the autumn of 1943, the 100th Infantry Battalion fought as a standard infantry unit attached to the 34th Division, taking and holding ground under artillery and small arms fire in mountainous terrain that favored the defender. Its performance there began to establish a reputation for aggressive, disciplined infantry work. That reputation solidified, and its cost became apparent during the assault on Monte Cassino in early 1944. Advancing across flooded, cratered terrain toward the Rapido River, where German engineers had deliberately breached irrigation dams to flood the approach and had cleared every tree and structure to eliminate cover, the 100th Battalion suffered such heavy losses that it earned the nickname Purple Heart Battalion for the proportion of its men wounded or killed. The unit's next major action came at Anzio. After the original Anzio landings of January 22, 1944, and months of static, costly fighting to defend the beachhead against determined German counterattacks, the depleted 100th Battalion landed there on March 26, 1944, as reinforcement. To help plan the eventual breakout, Lieutenant Young Ok Kim and Private Irving Akahoshi volunteered for a night reconnaissance mission through a minefield to capture German soldiers for interrogation. The two men crossed the wire, took 2 German prisoners, and the intelligence gathered from that interrogation contributed to Allied planning for the breakout from the Anzio beachhead that led toward Rome in late May 1944. The mechanism behind these successes was not exotic. It rested on disciplined small-unit infantry tactics, aggressive night patrolling, close artillery coordination, willingness to press attacks against fortified positions at high personal cost, and a demonstrated cohesion within units where soldiers had trained together for over a year at Camp Shelby before ever reaching a front line. What made the record historically significant was not novel technology or doctrine, but the fact that it was compiled by a unit whose members had been formally distrusted by their own government only months before deploying. The clearest institutional validation came from the Army's decision to keep expanding the Nice combat commitment rather than curtail it. On May 1, 1944, the newly trained 442nd Regimental Combat Team arrived in Italy and moved to join the battle-hardened 100th Battalion near Civitavecchia, north of Rome, shortly after the city's liberation on June 4, 1944. In recognition of its already established combat record, the 100th Battalion was formally designated the 1st Battalion of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, while being permitted to retain the 100th Battalion name, an unusual concession within Army administrative practice, granted specifically because of its documented performance in earlier campaigns. The 442nd, now including the veteran 100th, received its baptism of fire as a combined regiment at Suvarito, Italy on June 26, 1944, driving German forces from the town. For actions during this period, the unit earned a Presidential Unit Citation, originally a Distinguished Unit Citation. Following the liberation of Rome, the regiment took part in what its own veterans later called, half ruefully, the Second Battle of Rome, a night convoy through the city on June 9, 1944, in which March unit commanders repeatedly lost their bearings navigating around the walls of Vatican City in the dark, several columns circling back to St. Peter's Basilica more than once before finding the correct route north. Over the following 10 weeks, the 442nd fought its way north from Rome toward the Arno River, engaging German forces across mountainous terrain in the Rome-Arno campaign, driving enemy units back through successive defensive positions before reaching the Arno by midsummer 1944. The unit's operational scope then expanded well beyond Italy. In September 1944, the 442nd was redeployed to France to fight in the Vosges Mountains, attached to the 36th Infantry Division. There, in October 1944, following an order from Major General John E. Dahlquist to attack encircled German forces, a battalion of the 36th Division's 141st Infantry Regiment, soon known as the Lost Battalion, was surrounded and cut off. 2 rescue attempts by other units failed. The 442nd, under Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller after Colonel Pence's replacement, was ordered in for a 3rd attempt and after 5 days of close combat through the forest, made contact with the trapped unit on October 30, 1944, and secured its rescue. According to the regiment's own after-action accounting, the 442nd sustained over 800 casualties to rescue 211 surrounded soldiers. The regiment also fought alongside another segregated American unit, the African-American 92nd Infantry Division, later in the war, an operational pairing that placed 2 of the Army's segregated combat formations in direct cooperation against the same German defensive lines. In March 1945, the 442nd returned to Italy to take part in the final push against the Gothic Line, the last major German defensive system in the Italian peninsula, anchored along the Apennine Mountains. Moving at night up steep, heavily mined slopes to achieve tactical surprise, the regiment helped break through positions the German army had held for months, contributing to the collapse of organized German resistance in Italy shortly before the general German surrender in the theater on May 2, 1945. The military impact of the 100th 442nd combat record in Italy and France was immediate and measurable. Sustained pressure on German defensive lines across 2 theaters, a role in one of the war's most publicized rescue operations, and participation in the final collapse of German resistance in Italy. The wider social and political impact reached beyond the battlefield. At a time when 100,000 Japanese Americans remained behind barbed wire in the United States, the documented combat record of their relatives serving in Italy and France became one of the most visible counterarguments to the racial suspicion that had justified their incarceration in the first place. Public recognition of the unit's sacrifice, nearly 9,500 Purple Hearts and roughly 4,000 Bronze Star medals awarded to a unit whose peak strength never approached that of a full division, became part of the post-war case for restoring the civil standing of Japanese Americans, and eventually for the government's formal acknowledgement decades later that the incarceration itself had been a grave injustice. In the decades following the war, the record compiled by the 100th Infantry Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team was progressively re-examined and, in several respects, formally upgraded. A review of decorations awarded to Asian American soldiers, prompted by concerns that racial bias had led to Medals of Honor being downgraded to lesser decorations during the war, resulted in President Bill Clinton awarding 21 Medals of Honor to Asian American World War II veterans on June 21, 2000, 19 of them to men who had served in the 100th Battalion or 442nd Regimental Combat Team. 7 of the honorees were still living at the time of the ceremony, including Senator Daniel Inouye. In 2010, Congress voted to award the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service, formally recognizing their World War II service at the highest civilian honor level available. The unit's total wartime decorations, 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, roughly 4,000 Bronze Star medals, and close to 9,500 Purple Hearts, accumulated by a unit whose total wartime strength across all replacements was a fraction of a standard Army division, is the basis for its continued recognition, by size and length of service, as the most decorated unit in the history of the United States military. Its history is preserved today through institutions including the Go for Broke National Education Center, the National World War II Museum, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino and National Museum of American History, recognizing Virgil Miller's Puerto Rican heritage, and the Nisei Veterans Legacy Organizations in Hawaii, which continue to record oral histories from surviving veterans and their families. The problem this history opened with was never really a military one. It was a question the United States government asked about its own citizens, whether ancestry determined loyalty. The government's own policy in early 1942 answered that question wrongly, at enormous human cost to more than 100,000 people. The soldiers of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team did not set out to resolve a philosophical debate. They fought, campaign after campaign, from Salerno to the Gothic Line, under commanders who were not of their own community, for a country that had imprisoned their families. The record they built measured in captured positions, in a rescued battalion in the Vosges, in a broken defensive line in the Apennines, and in a casualty and decoration count disproportionate to the unit's size, did not erase the injustice of the incarceration. It did, however, leave a documented, verifiable answer to the question the government had asked, one that outlasted the wartime hysteria that had prompted the question in the first place. That record still matters today, not as a settled piece of nostalgia, but as a case study directly relevant to how democratic societies handle fear, suspicion, and the treatment of minority citizens during moments of national crisis. The soldiers of the 100th and 442nd did not have the option of proving their case in the abstract. They had to do it in the mountains of Italy and the forests of France at a cost recorded, unit by unit, in the Army's own after-action reports. That is the history. It required no embellishment then, and it requires none now.